Ever get that creepy feeling like someone's watching you? Like eyes in the back of your head,
Oh, yeah, I hate that.
But now imagine that feeling, but it's the government. And they're not just watching.
Oh, no.
They're like going through your stuff, your most private things.
Yeah, it's way worse.
That's the kind of unsettling thing we're dealing with in today's deep dive. We're going all the way back to 1967
Whoa, okay.
to the Philippines for this really important legal case, Stonehill versus Diokno. Have you heard of this one?
Oh, yeah, Stonehill versus Diokno. It's a classic. This case is like a total nail biter. You've got this powerful businessman going head to head with the government. It really gets to the core of like how do we balance law enforcement with protecting people's individual rights?
It's a tough one for sure. So paint a picture for us. Who was Stonehill and what exactly happened?
Okay, so picture this. Harry Stonehill, American businessman living the high life in the Philippines.
Okay, picturing it.
He was a big deal, involved in tons of different businesses, tobacco, textiles, you name it. He was probably in it.
Sounds like a real entrepreneur.
He was. But the government, they suspected him of some shady stuff. Tax evasion, bribery, all sorts of things. And they decided to, well, make an example out of him.
And that's where the 42 search warrants come in.
You got it. 42 search warrants.
That's a lot of paperwork.
It was a full-on dragnet. They didn't just target Stonehill, they went after everyone and everything even remotely connected to him. His associates, all the companies he was involved with. These warrants basically gave the authorities the green light to seize anything related to his business dealings.
Hold on a sec. So, like, if you and I ran a lemonade stand together
Yeah.
and they suspected you of something, they could come search my house too.
Potentially, yeah. That's the scary part. These warrants were so broadly written, they could have covered just about anything. We're talking books of accounts, financial records, vouchers, correspondence, receipts, like the list goes on and on. It's like they wanted to seize their entire lives.
Okay, yeah. I see why this is a big deal now. It sounds less like a targeted investigation and more like a fishing expedition. Like they were just hoping to find something, anything, to incriminate him. So what's stopping law enforcement from doing this all the time? Isn't there like a rule against these super broad general warrants?
You're exactly right. The Philippine Constitution, much like many constitutions around the world, has protections against unreasonable searches and seizures. It's not a free-for-all. They can't just barge into someone's home or business and take whatever they want. There needs to be a solid reason, what we call probable cause.
So in this case, the judges who issued the warrants, they didn't think the government had enough probable cause.
That's exactly what Stonehill and his associates argued.
And they won.
They did. The Philippine Supreme Court ultimately sided with them. It was a landmark decision.
Wow, taking on the government and winning. That's impressive.
It was a big one. The court ruled those warrants were null and void, basically useless. They said the government completely failed to specify exactly what laws were broken, what evidence they were even looking for. It was like saying, we think you did something wrong, so we're going to look at everything until we find proof.
It doesn't seem very fair, does it? I mean, innocent until proven guilty, right?
Yeah.
Did the government have a response to that?
Well, the court was actually divided on this one. Some justices disagreed, argued that even though the warrants were messed up, the evidence they gathered shouldn't be thrown out. They were worried that letting Stonehill get off on what they saw as a technicality would undermine law enforcement.
So even way back then, they were wrestling with this balancing act, protecting individuals versus maintaining order.
Oh, for sure. And this is where it gets even more interesting because this case forced the Philippines to confront a huge question about illegally obtained evidence. Can you use it or not?
So the court throws out these crazy broad warrants in Stonehill versus Diokno, right?
Right.
Like it's a big win for Stonehill, obviously, but what did it mean for everyone else? Like, did this case actually change how things worked in the Philippines?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. This is where it gets really interesting. Before Stonehill versus Diokno, the Philippines followed something called the non-exclusionary rule.
Okay, the non-exclusionary rule. What is
Yeah.
that?
Basically, it meant that even if the police got evidence illegally, like through a bad warrant or something, they could still use it in court.
So it didn't matter how they got the evidence as long as they got it. That doesn't sound right.
You're getting it. The court realized this created a really dangerous situation. It basically gave law enforcement an incentive to, maybe cut corners, maybe even violate people's rights because they knew they could still use whatever they found.
Yeah, like why follow the rules if you don't have to, right?
Exactly. But Stonehill versus Diokno, it flipped the script. The court basically said, look, if you obtain evidence illegally, it's inadmissible. We're not even going to look at it.
They shut that loophole down. That must have made a huge difference, knowing that they couldn't just rely on illegally obtained evidence anymore.
Oh, absolutely. It forced law enforcement to play by the rules, which is a good thing for everyone, right? It became a safeguard for regular people. If you think about it, it's a win for you, the individual. It means the authorities can't just trample on your rights to get a conviction. They have to follow the proper procedures, get valid warrants, and respect your privacy.
So Stonehill, standing up for himself, in a way, ended up protecting everyone else's rights, too. But I'm sure there were some people who weren't happy about this decision, right? Weren't some people worried that this would make it harder to, solve crimes and catch criminals?
Oh, definitely. There's always that tension, that balance between security and liberty. Some people argued that the court was basically tying the hands of law enforcement, letting criminals go free because of a technicality.
And the court considered this. It must have been a hard choice.
It was a tough one, for sure. The justices who disagreed with the majority opinion in Stonehill versus Diokno, they felt very strongly that excluding illegally obtained evidence would make it much harder for law enforcement to do their job and keep the country safe. But the majority of the court, they felt that upholding the integrity of the legal process was more important. They believed that allowing illegally obtained evidence, even in some cases, would be like a slippery slope. Where does it end? It could undermine the rule of law and ultimately chip away at everyone's rights.
Yeah, I see their point. If the government can just ignore the rules whenever it's convenient, then what's stopping them from abusing their power in other areas?
Exactly. It sets a really dangerous precedent. Stonehill versus Diokno really highlighted the idea that the ends don't justify the means. Even if you have good intentions, even if you're trying to catch a bad guy, you can't just throw out the rule book. You have to follow the rules.
It's a pretty big concept, isn't it? It's not just about one businessman and a bunch of documents. This case forced a whole country to really rethink how it balances security and individual rights.
It really did. And it's a conversation that's still happening today, actually, especially with all the technology and data we have now. All of our stuff is online, our emails, our browsing history, our financial records, all of it. It makes you think, how do we protect our privacy in a digital world?
Okay, so how does a case from, like, 1967 about a businessman and his papers connect to my online life today? It's not like the police are breaking down my door to, like, seize my laptop.
Well, maybe not in the same way, but the principle is the same. Think of it this way. All of that digital data, it's an extension of you. It's just as personal and private as the things you have in your home. And the government, they don't have the right to access all of that without a good reason, without proper oversight.
But how do you even apply the idea of a search warrant to something like, I don't know, email or browsing history? It's not like they're physically stored in a filing cabinet somewhere.
Right, that's the challenge we're facing now. The laws around search warrants, all of that was developed way before the internet. Applying those same rules to the online world, it's not always easy.
Yeah, makes sense.
You got to think about it. A warrant that might have seemed pretty specific back in 1967 could be way too broad in today's world. Imagine a warrant that just says, like, seize all electronic devices from a suspect's home. That could be anything. Phones, computers, tablets, even smart TVs. It's way too much.
Sounds like a digital fishing expedition to me. It seems like we need a smarter, more specific approach to warrants when we're talking about online data.
I think we do, and that's where the legacy of Stonehill versus Diokno comes in. This case set a precedent, gave us a framework for safeguarding privacy, even as technology keeps changing and evolving.
So we've really dug into this Stonehill versus Diokno case, and I think it's pretty clear it had a massive impact on the Philippines legal system. But I gotta say, I'm still trying to wrap my head around how this all applies to me, in the 21st century. It feels like a completely different world now. Everything's online.
That's the big question, isn't it? How do we take these principles from Stonehill versus Diokno, like this idea that our homes, our things, our private stuff is protected, and apply them to this digital world where so much of our lives are online?
Exactly. I'm not really worried about the police, like, breaking down my door and taking my diary. You know what I mean? I'm worried about someone hacking my email or, like, the government looking at my browsing history without me knowing. It feels like the rules need to, like, catch up with technology.
I agree. You're absolutely right. And honestly, the law is always playing catch up with technology. Stonehill versus Diokno gives us a framework, some principles we can use, but figuring out how they work in the digital world takes some real thought. We need to ask ourselves, what does a reasonable search even mean these days? When we're talking about mountains of data, how specific does a warrant need to be for it to be okay?
So are there any laws being written now or any court cases that are trying to figure this out? It feels like everyone's talking about this.
Yeah, definitely. All around the world, courts and governments are wrestling with these exact questions. Some countries are pushing for tougher rules on government surveillance, like they want warrants to be required even to access metadata.
Metadata. Hold on. Remind me what that is again.
Oh, right. So metadata is like the information about your online activity, but not the content itself. Think of it like the who, when, and where of your emails, your calls, all that stuff.
So even if they're not reading my emails, they can still see who I'm talking to, when, and from where.
Yeah.
That still feels like a pretty big invasion of privacy.
Yeah, it is. And this is where things get really complicated. Some people say metadata isn't as sensitive as the actual content, the words in your emails. So they think it shouldn't require the same level of like legal oversight. But other people argue that metadata can actually tell you a lot about a person, about their life, their relationships, even their beliefs. Things they might not want the government knowing.
It's a tough one, right? Trying to find that balance. Security versus privacy. I get it, we need law enforcement to be able to do their jobs, especially with terrorism and things like that. But I also don't want to just give up all my privacy.
It's a constant balancing act, and there are no easy answers, that's for sure. But Stonehill versus Diokno reminds us that we can't just sit back and let things happen. We have to stay informed, keep talking about these issues, and make sure the government is respecting our digital rights.
So it's not just about some old legal case. It's about how these cases actually affect our lives today, even online.
Exactly. The fight for privacy never really ends. Cases like Stonehill versus Diokno, even though they happened a long time ago, they're still relevant. They give us a way to think about these issues in the digital age.
This deep dive has been really interesting. I learned a lot. Stonehill versus Diokno isn't just some history lesson. It's a reminder that privacy and due process, these are important, and we need to protect them, especially in this digital world. Thanks for listening, everybody.